Hey, welcome everyone. I'm James Brooks, president of SAR, and we're continuing our now, I think, 4-year-old Spark series of afternoon lectures on offbeat New Mexico, and are really honored and delighted to have both Miguel Gandert and Chris Wilson with us today to launch their new book, which is quite spectacular. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, there are books for sale just outside the door. Miguel, as many of you know, is an award-winning documentary and fine arts photographer and filmmaker. He's Distinguished Professor of Communication and Journalism and Director of the Interdisciplinary Film and Digital Media Program at UNM. Chris Wilson is the J.B. Jackson Professor of Cultural Landscape Studies at UNM School of Architecture and Planning in Albuquerque, and founding director of its Historic Preservation and Regionalism program. Chris has written widely on architecture, tourism, and the politics of culture in the Southwest, and on cultural landscape studies. Chris's collaboration with Miguel Gandert, Stefanos Polizoidos, and others, the Plazas of New Mexico, analyzes the history of Pueblo, Hispanic, and Anglo planning traditions, exemplified by 22 classic communities, and surveys work over the past 15 years to revitalize existing community spaces and to create new ones. Please join me in welcoming Miguel and Chris.
Well, thank you so much, James. And it's wonderful to be here at this magnificent institution and in this really great room. I think of myself as the director of the Historic Preservation and Regionalism program as being a lowercase Edgar Lee Hewitt, a booster of a cultural institution. The Historic Preservation and Regionalism program is an attempt to connect the institution to working with local communities, not just in terms of historic preservation, but contemporary design, planning, economic and community development grounded in history, culture, and place. At any point, we have a research initiative that's ongoing, and our research seminar currently is focusing on early suburban nodes in Albuquerque that are retrofittable to more sustainable pedestrian and transit-oriented nodes. An earlier research focus was the study of New Mexico plazas and squares that produced our book, The Plazas of New Mexico, a traveling exhibit that's currently at New Mexico State, and the subject of our talk here today. New Mexico, people have been creating plazas in New Mexico for 1,000 years. And with 3 different cultural traditions of community placemaking, I'll say at the risk of being a chauvinist, our state has both the longest and the most varied set of traditions of public space making. These 3 planning traditions, the Pueblo, the Hispanic, and the Anglo, each combine a public space form, a plaza, a square, with building types that impart a particular character to that space. So for the Pueblos, it's the religious chamber, the kiva, and the residential blocks that impart a religious and everyday residential character. The same holds true for most Hispanic plazas. The church, the courtyard, extended family houses give a residential and religious coloring to them. But for the Anglo-American courthouse squares, it's much more of a secular and mercantile setting with the combination of the courthouse and surrounding business blocks. Community celebrations in each tradition likewise reinforce and reproduce community identity over the years and over the generations. Ritual dances to ensure bountiful hunting and crops in the Pueblos, religious processions asserting Catholic beliefs and folk dramas recalling local conquest history in Spanish plazas, and 4th of July and Old Timers Day celebrations in Anglo Courthouse Square towns, which have that modern secular identity. I'll be sketching these 3 traditions, these ensembles of public space, associated building types, and community celebrations, and then touching and closing in the way in which these traditions are coming back today, both by revitalizing historic community places and by incorporating plazas and squares into new sustainable community design. people have been creating community spaces starting in about the year 700 in Pueblo villages, and we're seeing, of course, Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon here. Again, residential blocks, terraced, facing down to the southeast for passive solar gain, circular religious chambers, decided to focus on a religious life. We use the term plaza, but I think it's important to realize that this is not plaza in the European sense with the added function of being a transportation crossroads and a marketplace. Because as you can see here, there's a single story file of buildings which in fact closes in the space, which we might call a courtyard instead. So it's not a place where roads come together and markets are held, but it has much more a decided religious function. In this case, we know from excavated root pockets that there was a sole ponderosa pine here. Not a tree that was indigenous to Chaco Canyon, may have come from Mount Taylor to the south or the Lucachucay Mountains to the west. And we know from original cultures and civilizations around the world, such a vertical forms an axis mundi, which connects a sacred ground plane, or in the case of the Pueblos, sacred subterranean levels with the present world and up to the sky. You undoubtedly will be familiar with the work of Alfonso Ortiz and his book, The Tewa World, and with Rena Swinsel's many beautiful, quiet essays about Pueblo worldview and spatial cosmology. And in this brief summary, I'm drawing on them and their deep knowledge of those traditions. As they explain, the Pueblo view of the world in mythology and song and everyday language is that a Pueblo world is a spherical world made up of an earth bowl and a sky basket. And that's a conception of the world which is perceived at various scales. The largest scale is the containment of mountains, sacred mountains at the four cardinal directions, the surrounding foothills, often with shrines on tops of mesas, likewise form a containing bowl. The villages themselves, whether formal Chacoan villages or more incremental and irregular Rio Grande pueblos, are perceived of as an earth bowl containing a sacred center. Sometimes, though not always, defined by the kiva, which itself is an earth bowl. Its ceiling of log vigas and branches forming the sky basket in that place, with an earth navel, with a sacred center, a bupunge in the language of the Tewa in the Espanola Valley, the earth belly root at the center of the kiva. In ways that are maybe difficult for us as primarily Euro-Americans here today to understand, this is a view of the world in which everything is sacred. It's infused by a life force in Tewa, the Pawaha, the water, wind, breath, which flows through everything, not just living people and animals, but through rocks, through the windows and doors of houses. So the distinction between animate and inanimate is not made. The life force informs and infuses everything. It flows in and out of our mouths. Buildings viewed as living beings, blessed at construction, blessed over their life. The life force flowing in and out of their doors and windows as they do through our mouths, and particularly at points where there's a connection between subterranean levels and underworld, and in most conceptions, 3 layers of underworld, where ancestors dwell, where supernatural beings, katsinas, live and migrated over time up to this Earth's surface today. Points of connection, caves, clefts in the earth, places where springs come to the surface of the earth, where the mountains reach up seemingly to touch the sky. These are often viewed as sacred centers, as earth navels that make a connection between the underworld and the above world. And I think that sense of containment of an earth bowl and a sky basket is nowhere more clear than in the Espanola Valley, where those Tewa-speaking pueblos are close to the Rio Grande, where the Sangre de Cristos on the east, the Jemez on the west, form an almost symmetrical earth bowl. And then in late July and August, when the late afternoon thunderstorm clouds form up seemingly off of the mountaintops and are the presence of that life force and in fact the presence of the Cachinas, they cruise over the valley and complete that earth bowl and sky basket. So the containment of the surrounding foothills, a sacred mesa, Black Mesa, south of Santa Clara Pueblo, which we see here about 1880. You can see how the village contains the sacred plaza, in this case a rectangular kiva. So, as I'll try to do with each of these three traditions, placing community celebration and ritual in relationship to the community space and the surrounding building types. In his classic 1891 study of Pueblo architecture, Victor Mendeleev describes dances at the Hopi plazas, and we're seeing a contemporaneous image of the main plaza at Zuni on the left. Mendeleev writes, "In earlier times too, so the priests relate, people were more devout and the houses were planned with their terraces fronting the courts, so that the women and children and all the people could be close to the mass dancers, the katsinas, as they issued from the kiva. The spectators filled the terraces, and sitting there, they watched the katsinas dance in the court, and the women sprinkled cornmeal upon them while they listened to their songs." Or to continue with this thought, Alfonso Ortiz once wrote, "Anyone who has had the great fortune of following the circuit of calendrical rituals can appreciate how fully the drama mobilizes a community's moods and motivations and reflects their collective identity. Spring, summer, and fall dances, of course, are meant to ensure rain and the fertility of crops, while winter dances are especially focused on successful hunts and abundant game. As you likely know, there's been a renaissance of Pueblo religious practice in the last generation. New kivas have been constructed at some of the pueblos, and dances, which once might have had a few dozen people, now can number 200 or 300 people with a chorus of 60 drummers and singers, fueled both by population growth and by Pueblo people who have had to leave and go further afield for education and jobs, who come home for primary dance and celebration days to reaffirm their cultural identity. The second of our cultural traditions, the Spanish tradition in town planning, is in fact a hybridization, a syncretism of old world traditions and new world traditions. The Greek town planning idea of a gridded town with a public space in the center, the agora, of course, is carried on in Roman military town planning. It fades into the background in the Middle Ages, but in the late Middle Ages, the attempt to repopulate areas which had been ravaged by war and declining population, a practice of noble lords and of lords of the princes of the church licensing groups of merchants to establish new towns led to the formation of what are referred to, using the French term, although it's a European international phenomenon, bastide towns. These merchants were given licenses to establish a town. They were to be defensible and fortified. They had the right to hold weekly markets. They gave some taxes to the local noble lords. And the most common form of these bastide towns were gridiron plans with a walled perimeter with a square in the middle, which usually was a market square, sometimes a church square. It's a form of town planning which, in fact, the Christian monarchs of Spain used as they were reconquering the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. So, in fact, what we're seeing here is the last Spanish bastide. It's the Spanish siege town of Santa Fe, Spain, which was laid out in 1492 outside the Alhambra and outside of Granada as a way to organize this military encampment as they laid their successful siege on the Alhambra. And so you see the grid of streets, the open square, the church facing onto that. A characteristic celebration of those days would be Moros y Cristianos, the reenactment of the conquest in these public spaces. And so this reconquest, of course, as many people have pointed out, did not end in 1492 in Spain. It continued to the New World. So by 1502, at Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, the first Spanish town, it is founded by veterans of this siege town. It is a gridiron town with a church facing onto a square in which they enacted Moros and Cristianos in the sense that the local native leaders seeing this ceremony would be encouraged to see themselves in the role of the conquered and converted Moors. So the European antecedents are very clear, and yet when Hernán Cortés and his men in the 1518 come to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, they encounter a city of perhaps 200,000 people. And they've just departed from Seville, which is a city of 30,000. And so, in fact, they're very impressed by the size, the opulence, the urbanism of the Aztecs, who founded their cities on a combination of canals and streets, but in a gridiron pattern with a temple precinct, an open space with the religious dwellings in it in the middle of the city, and then a market square to the side. They briefly considered, once they had conquered the Aztecs, establishing a new capital, but they said, no, there are all these resources here. This is the seat of power. This is where the transportation routes converge. And so they took over the city, maintained many of the streets, turned the market square into what we know today as the Zocalo, with the cathedral and the parroquia facing onto it. So they had a tradition of these gridiron bastide towns, which was then reinforced by encountering very similar towns, which in fact they often reused and adapted to their needs. For the first 3 generations, it's a process of the Spanish crown and the bureaucracy issuing land grants with instructions on how to establish towns in a piecemeal fashion. Finally, in 1572, Philip II issues a set of town planning ordinances, usually referred to as the Laws of the Indies, to standardize this planning. And so Santa Fe is laid out following that, those set of directions. They instruct the colonists on how to select a good site, but once the site is selected, they say the starting point of a town is the plaza. You lay down the plaza first. It's very clear that's the center of the identity. It's the place where the militia can muster in case of attack. It's a place in which the church is central and is given the first choice of a block facing onto the plaza. And in fact, encouraged then to, if it's a rectangular plaza, the church should be on the narrow end because it receives more prominence. If there's topography, the church should be at an elevated site. The original plaza, as you may know, in Santa Fe was rectangular and reached all the way up to the cathedral and Cathedral Place. The first church was here. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and then through the Reconquest in 1693, the Pueblos that occupied it had built a Pueblo community of multi-storied terrace buildings, 2 plazas with kivas, and I think that's where the eastern half of the plaza, the Spanish plaza, got lost. It's relocated over to the side. The last detail that I'll note here is that the church faces to the west, and in Europe that was the practice and the preference. Given the choice, the altar should be in the east in the direction of the Holy Lands, which meant that European churches predominantly faced west. That changes because of new architectural ideas in Europe. As part of the Catholic Church counter-Reformation response to the Protestant Reformation of the North, the Jesuits, of course, intellectual leaders of that response, employ architecture to enhance the grandeur of the liturgy, of the Mass. And what we're seeing here is Il Jesu from the 1560s in Rome. It's the mother church, if that's the correct terminology, for the Jesuits' administrative seat in Rome. It's very influential on parish churches in Mexico and, in fact, throughout much of Europe. And it's this combination of a cruciform cross-shaped plan, there are side aisles, but a cruciform plan with a dome over the transept, as we can see here, on a drum, punctured by windows, and bringing hidden light from above, flooding in onto gilt-covered opulent altars. That hidden light from above is, of course, the presence, the heavenly presence of the Holy Spirit, of the Holy Trinity, flooding in onto the altar. Now, in New Mexico, the Franciscans, of course, worked primarily with Pueblo builders to erect mission churches. It's possible to make domes out of adobe, but neither the Pueblos nor the Franciscan missionaries knew how to do that. So if they wanted to use this lighting scheme, they had to translate it into the flat roof construction of New Mexico, which they did very likely in the 1680s at the peak of the mission building. And what they did is they simply, 2/3 of the way down the nave, if there was a transept, it would be here. They step up the roof 2 or 3 feet and insert a window, a so-called transverse clear story window in here, which, as in El Jesu, brings light, hidden light from above, the Holy Spirit flooding in onto the altar. This had the effect of churches in New Mexico after that point overwhelmingly being oriented to the east or southeast so that the lighting scheme would work at the time of morning Mass. So the original church location and where the cathedral is, San Miguel here in Santa Fe, were built before the invention of the clear story window, and they face west in traditional European form. But as George Kubler showed years ago, 85% of the churches in New Mexico built after that date using the clear story window face east or southeast. Now, this occurred at the Indian pueblos in the mission complexes, but pretty quickly, by the 1680s, this new clear story window is united with the law of the Indies town-centered plan at El Paso del Norte, current-day Ciudad Juarez, which was a villa of New Mexico, after all, in those days. And what we're seeing is the church in El Paso, see clearly where the clear story window is. This photograph probably taken from the roof looking back across the plaza. So this becomes the ensemble, not just of a plaza with a church, but a church oriented to the southeast, adapted to local lighting considerations. And I didn't lay the groundwork for that, but also a secondary Pueblo and sacred orientation to the southeast, to the rising sun. The rituals of the Spanish plazas, some of them are universal to the Catholic Church. Corpus Christi celebrations, posadas, processions on Christmas Eve and so forth. Wedding and funerals that might start in the church but then process to a cemetery or to a parish hall for a celebration. That's what we're seeing on the upper right. But then some of those celebrations are grounded in local history. Los Marochines, Los Comanches, and other celebrations recount conquest encounters between native and Spanish populations. They're about conquest, they're about conversion, but they're also about mestizaje, about the racial and cultural mixing that brought many of these communities to life. And I'm running a little long for my time, so I'm going to skip over or abbreviate the subsequent layers of international neoclassicism in the geometric civic square laid down in the Santa Fe Plaza in 1863. And then, of course, the national and international fad of public celebrations in the years leading up to the First World War, cast as mytho-historic community celebrations, which was the genesis starting in 1912 of the modern Santa Fe Fiesta and its historic reenactments. The final of those three traditions, the Anglo-American Courthouse Square, as I've already suggested, is tied to a new secular, mercantile, positivist culture of the American nation. It's also tied to the rise of democracy. There are counties in the American colonies. Virginia is the most prominent one. But in that case, the courthouse is at a crossroads. It's not even really a major trades settlement. But as people, after independence, cross the Appalachians and the governmental unit of the county gets linked to the mercantile and later railroad towns, you get a new form that develops. And the most common way of accomplishing this is to simply take the gridiron plan of the real estate speculator and to designate one of the squares for the government building, for the county courthouse. On the right, we're seeing a map that a cultural geographer who spent his summer cruising the middle of the country looking for courthouse squares and identified the oldest of these at Shelbyville, Kentucky, 1810, and how this spread through the country. He's got a question mark, 1898. I don't know, that might be Portales. In fact, there are a dozen courthouse squares in New Mexico, mainly in the eastern side of the state. So we say Courthouse Square, but it's important to remember that overwhelmingly the perimeter is lined by commercial buildings, by business blocks, which might be commercial and mercantile on the ground floor, but they're mixed use above. It might be a hotel, it might be a fraternal lodge, could be the premier professional offices in the city, as is the case here. It could be around courthouses. The offices in the upper floors are overwhelmingly attorneys, mortgage companies, surveyors, people with business in the courthouse. And so the Courthouse Square is a perfect physical manifestation of the alliance between commerce, real estate state speculation, business, and government. The celebrations, again, are some national, 4th of July parades, for instance, and celebrations, or there's a wave of local identity and celebration that begins within a generation, not more than two after settlement, and the holding of old-timers reunions, pioneer days, and these become institutionalized in local communities as annual celebrations, kind of parallel to the Santa Fe Fiesta. So those are the three traditions of public space, the associated building types, the community celebrations that focus and reproduce community identity over time. The Puebloan, of course, focused along the upper Rio Grande and then Acoma, Zuni, the Hopi Pueblos. The Hispanic plazas and communities, again, focused on the upper Rio Grande, settlers pushing out in all directions, significantly into southern Colorado. A second cultural hearth at El Paso del Norte, and in the 1840s to 60s, another thrust and establishment of Hispanic plazas there. And then finally, in the eastern third of the state, with Anglo-Texans and others coming from the Midwest, a set of Anglo-American courthouse squares, and a sprinkling of those along railroad lines. Aztec, Gallup, and a few in the southern part of the state. There's an attempt to keep this tradition going in the 20th century. This is the 1916 copper mining company town of Tyrone, New Mexico, with a plaza at its center. A proposal in 1963 for the Santa Fe Capitol to not build a magnificent monumental building, but instead to say that courtyards and plazas are in fact our civic identity and our civic place. Not executed, but a very suggestive alternative to the monumental tradition. Of course, these public space traditions were very largely abandoned as the automobile became predominant from the 1920s on, much more spatially diffused landscape. There's been a response to that, of course. The grassroots historic preservation movement starting in the mid-1950s all across the country. The new urbanism movement with the idea of basing new towns on traditional towns, a community space in the middle, mixed-use buildings around the perimeter, population within walking distance of this space, linked to transit planning, in which each station is conceived as the starting point of a mixed-use, pedestrian, transit-oriented, higher density, more sustainable settlement. Some of these ideas applied in Aldea, here in Santa Fe, primarily the traditional neighborhood design, the plaza-centered design. At UNM, we've tried to make a contribution with this research initiative that I've described to you, documenting about 65 of these community spaces so that we can really understand that tradition, can try to contribute to the revitalization of some of these community spaces. This is a community plaza as we first found it on our first field trip to the South, and State Senator Mary Jane Garcia met us and talked to us for a while, and then she said, can you help us do something with our plaza? And gestured to the asphalt parking lot. And so we worked with the community. What did they need from their plaza? How did they use it? And we diagrammed this, for instance, on Good Friday, how they used the space, conducted a design charrette with them to come up with a design for that space. And it's one of, I guess, 4 community spaces that we've worked with now that have had physical redesigns and revitalization. This move to community plazas can also include new town plazas. I mentioned Aldea. They don't have to take a traditionalist form. This is the civic plaza for Mesa del Sol, that planned community south of the airport in Albuquerque with a modernist building and unconventional community space designed by Antoine Predock. So I'll leave it there and pass it off to Miguel.
It's funny, I'm always a little intimidated by coming after Chris because you get all the information and I sort of do a little different kind of what I talking about the plazas of New Mexico, but it's really about how I became a landscape architectural photographer. It's funny, I'm a distinguished professor, and it's because I've had the best teachers in the world. James Brooks brought up being with Enrique this weekend at SMU, who I've done many projects, and of course, Chris Wilson. I get to travel with the 2 smartest people in New Mexico, and then I get to learn all the things that they learn. I've taught in the historic preservation. I've taught in the architecture program. I couldn't build anything, but I know how to look at them. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that and the evolution of how this project came to be. Years ago, when I did a show, my first show at the museum, and my first grant right out of graduate school, I did a book called The Essential Landscape with the museum, and it was called the New Mexico Photographic Survey, and I got the opportunity to meet and later work with J.B. Jackson. And J.B. Jackson taught me how to look at the environment, and he taught me because as a great teacher, he was a great listener. And he would ask a question, and then he would wait, and you would answer him. And later on, he did an actual series of lectures for Rice University. And because of the way that I was looking at the environment, and this is a picture from the New Mexico Photographic Survey and Space, he asked me to travel with him and illustrate his series of lectures that he did at Rice. This is a picture of downtown Civic Plaza. And when Chris Wilson first came to me, he said, I want you to do this book, The Plazas of New Mexico, with me and Stefanos Palazoides and Jose Zelaya, who did the really beautiful, exquisite drawings in the book. Chris's son did a wonderful one that he saw, the kivas. And I looked at him and I said, are you crazy? I am not an architectural photographer. And of course, the really elegantly photographed book on the meme houses by Robert Reck, who worked with Chris. And I said, I don't do that. I do people and I do the environment. And sort of the conversation came up, and Chris says, no, you're an architectural photographer. And so we started talking about this picture that we had used for a poster called Paradise Paved for a conference that Gingy Scharf did at UNM. And we pulled this one out of Profundo, and Chris taught me about how all of the spaces, and this is up in Talpa, actually probably Greg is in that picture, the Gregorio Gonzalez who was with them at SMU. I love the small world that New Mexico is. That's his grandfather and his father back there playing the drums. And Chris explained how in my photographs, especially the ones up in Taos, that we could see that every house had a courtyard and a space in which to dance, even though this dance only happens once a year. And unlike the Pueblos, which on the same day, on January 1st, that this dance happens, the Comanches happen, there's 5,000 tourists up at Taos Pueblo, and here that the dance goes to different people. But as I began to look at my own photographs, I began to learn that they were also about space in a different way of people utilizing space. But this house, much like a kiva, had its own space for dance and performance. Most of the year would be a parking lot. During the 1st of January for the feast day of Emmanuel, the Dia de los Manueles, the cars would be moved out, and at every house they would be able to go. So as I worked with Chris, and he pulled this out of Profundo, and he said, no, this is what you're going to do. And he says, for the architects and the people who need to know the space, what we're going to do is there's going to be Jose's drawings. There's going to be these really great, beautiful, formal drawings. And Jose, of course, did one of the redesigns on one of the plazas in Monticello, which is featured in the book, and also was part of his master's thesis. This being I always like to think of this, although my friends in Bernalillo get really mad at me, I like to think of this as probably the oldest matachinas. This is in Alcalde, which is the closest traditional now Hispano village to the original settlement of San Gabriel, which is where Oñate first made prior to him coming to Santa Fe. And this is a matachinas, and Chris said, well, look, this is the way, you show people in space, and that's what we really have to do. Instead of most architectural photographer, people are there to show scale of buildings. And so he convinced me reluctantly to start on this multi-year quest. And I realized that as we were looking a lot at the panoramic photographs that I'd done. And at this point in time, I was using a camera called a Widelux. It's kind of a confusing little camera where the film is wrapped around the drum, and then the lens moves and takes the picture over time. And so you can see kind of these sweeping corners, and then you have the problem of the buildings on the end puckering. And so I started using this at the beginning. And this one, which is one of my favorite pictures, and from almost the inception of the project, we thought was going to be the cover of the book, but it never ended up. This is the old plaza in Las Vegas. And then I took this while we were there. Those are some of the students in the background as we began to explore the plazas, and I traveled with Chris and the class that he and Stefanos Palazoidis were teaching. This is like my favorite, I don't know where the laser is. I want this building. It's just this wonderful little gestural building on the kind of south side of the plaza. But I became really intrigued with how people use space. And of course, this is where you would come to take your wedding photographs and things. And I was using the panoramic camera, the Widelux, the one I have. This one you can really see the pucker. This is 4th of July in Las Vegas, and it's probably one of my favorite events. The other thing Chris actually learned about me is that to do a book with Chris, all he has to do is say road trip. And our first road trip was actually when we were doing Profundo, and I had asked him to edit the book. I had read some of the chapters of the Myth of Santa Fe. For some reason, he never gave me the historical chapters. He only gave me the interludes to read. He probably didn't want me commenting on history because I didn't know anything. We traveled up to Talpa and to Taos so that he wanted to see me in action, because he convinced me that he and For Profundo needed to write the biographical piece of the book. And so it was really important, and that was our first road trip. I picked him up in Tesuque at 6 in the morning, and we drove up to Talpa and Ranchos. But one of the things he asked me to do was to put the people back into the community. And so for a while I was using this wide lux, and this is Gonzalo and his band, and 4th of July, which is the major feast day for Las Vegas. And it's a very patriotic reason that it's the 4th of July is the feast day. I like to think that all sorts of levels of patriotism. When George Bush couldn't find Osama bin Laden, they found him in Las Vegas, so there he is being dragged behind a lowrider. But, you know, we began to travel and see the state and look at the different ways that communities celebrate. I had predominantly only worked traditionally in Hispanic and Native American communities, and being that's what Profundo was. But we went all over the state to look for things and to look at community celebrations. This is Labor Day in Carlsbad, yeah. And you can, I mean, this probably should be in color. I mean, it's red, white, and blue and very patriotic. I got to photograph other community spaces and do my own takes on classic spaces. We went and revisited places. This is, of course, being Ranchos de Taos, probably the most photographed building in New Mexico, if not one of the most photographed in the world. And probably more famous photographers have stood there. You know, Paul Strand, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston. So I got to do my take, and because I'm doing the Plaza book, I get to add all sorts of other dimensions, the telephone poles, the wires, the things that aren't existing in the more romantic views. At the time I was doing this, after Las Vegas, I realized I needed another camera. Although I really liked the way the wide lux puckered on the edges, it wasn't quite what I wanted, and I found another film camera that was made by a company that called Hasselblad. Cost way too much money, but it shot on 35 millimeter film. It was called an X-Pan, and it was a flat, and it is a flat field panoramic camera, and I use it a lot. After I did the Plaza book, the influence the camera had on my vision allowed me to do a book that came out last year that I did with Arturo Madrid, called In the Country of the Broken Crosses, which is a Hispanic Presbyterian memoir where I photographed mostly landscape again and nostalgia of the history, really a family history of Hispanic Presbyterians. And then later, a forthcoming book about historic preservation and urban space that'll come out in August, a book called Hotel Mariachi that Enrique Lamadrid wrote one of the essays, and a woman who works for CARTA, the Camino Real Trail Association, Catherine Curlin, wrote the other one that's about historic preservation, and a hotel in Los Angeles that when I first started doing field work, 100 mariachis lived in this one hotel. And but that book was influenced by the work I was doing in historic preservation and heritage, and there are a number of pictures that I continued to use, the panoramic as well as the more traditional film camera that I'd been using, which was a 35 millimeter. So this project has had a tremendous influence, not only on what I've done, but also the kinds of work that I do. And this camera allowed me to do a lot more different things. This is San Juan, Pueblo, and it's another picture. We saw one earlier in Chris's talk, but this is the drummers for the day of the Feast of John the Baptist there. And what it did, it allowed me to really utilize the long frame that seemed more appropriate to dealing with the kinds of spaces that we were looking at, and enabled me to include more detail, but also allowed me to continue to work very intimately and close. It had a really two kind of extraordinarily wide-angle lenses that allowed me to work in very close. And sometimes magical things happen with it. This wasn't a picture that's in the book, but it's the kind of experience that I had as I traveled and did this book. I was teaching a summer field school. I do that a lot for UNM. And sometimes I know when I should photograph, and sometimes I know when I can't photograph, and sometimes I don't know the difference. And I was up at Sandia Pueblo for the Feast of San Antonio, and I walked around a corner there, and I saw a young Native American man sitting there with a snow cone machine, and a young woman selling snow cones. Maybe the same woman. And about a week later, and at Sandia, you just don't even think about it. And a week later, I'm at this feast day, and one of those magical moments why I love being a photographer, I walked around a corner at San Juan Pueblo, and there was the snow cone machine and a young man in his paint. But the camera allowed me to really utilize that camera and utilize that frame in order to explore both wide spaces but also very intimate spaces. This is, really key picture. People always ask me why there aren't a lot of photographs in Profundo of Santa Fe. In fact, there aren't any. And Santa Fe is a very strange community. It's the community I grew up in. I was born in Española, but moved to Santa Fe when I was 3. And somehow, this kind of, and you can read about it in Chris's book, The Myth of Santa Fe, this kind of fantasy heritage of Santa Fe always bothered me. And I found the profound celebrations and community celebrations were those found in the villages and up and down the Rio Grande. But this is, of course, Nuestra Señora de la Paz, formerly La Conquistadora, or if talked to a lot of different Santa Feans, still La Conquistadora. But this was for the fiesta, and it was actually the first time I photographed the fiesta other than photographing Zozobra as a journalist. And this picture I'm quite fond of. Chris likes to think this is a landmark picture for me. This is probably why I'm a photographer. I mean, where else can you hang out with teenagers, lay on the ground, and take pictures? But one of the things that we began to talk about and really working with Chris, we traveled together a lot of the times to make the images for the book. We talked about different ways of seeing. And one of the things we talked about is how do we see in layers? That being the monument on the plaza. Anybody from Santa Fe knows that that's Santa Fe. But then there's these other layers of the contested space, which is the Santa Fe Plaza. When I grew up and I was young in Santa Fe, what's now Sweeney Center was Santa Fe High School and later Santa Fe Mid-High. But they used to have like gang fights in the middle of the plaza, and they had to move away as they gentrified the plaza. So this is still a contested space. These are what they call plaza rats, and they still come out and they possess the plaza during the summers in different parts of the year. So this is probably, I think Chris is right when he told me that this was a real picture that sent a lot of my work to another level. And I think it's just a very sensuous and very beautiful image, but yet it's very much about how people use the space in the plaza. But there's other pictures. This is a picture that Stefanos Palazoidis really loved, where you get to see the architecture, you get the sense of space, you can compare it to Jose Zelaya's drawings, but yet we also see how the space is being utilized as a public space. Different plazas we went to. This is the farmer's market in Socorro. It's a pretty sad farmer's market. I think there were like 10 people selling the veggies they were growing, but which for me is actually a tremendous inspiration. The farmers market and are growing. The amount of organic farms is growing. It's just kind of a pity that the drought and things that are happening now in New Mexico are going to make this all more difficult and problematic. But so farmers market in Socorro. This is, of course, the plaza in Taos. I love how the fact that Aztecas come from Mexico, Dallas, Denver, Chicago, and the Taos Plaza is then converted into a sacred space. And so it becomes a sacred space every year in February. when I teach fieldwork, I'm always trying to teach my students about participant observation. And when I went to photograph this, I came the night before, and they had a gathering, in a religious gathering, and they did a sweat, and everybody likes a good sweat. And so they asked me if I wanted to do the sweat, and I said, sure. And then I got in the sweat, and I realized I couldn't leave because the sweat was for, and I was really being granted an honor, and this is why I love being a photographer as well. The sweat was to the 4 sacred directions, and once I got in there, I couldn't leave. I had to learn prayers in Nahuatl. And of course, the other 3 guys doing the sweat did it all the time. And I found in between prayers, I was burying my head into the corner of the tarp over the sweat, trying to breathe cool air in. And then I was so exhausted afterwards, I fell asleep on the floor. And they were laughing at me. It was like, well, you know, you could have photographed all this other stuff. Why aren't you photographing? And it was like, because I can't even move. So watch out. And I was east, by the way. And just watch out. It's dangerous being east sometimes. This is another picture from that. And I use very wide-angle lenses when I shoot. I still shoot film. My students, I run the interdisciplinary film and digital media program at UNM, and everything, of course, we do is digital. The film in that refers to the film industry, not film itself. I don't know if you've all heard, Fuji just quit making movie film. So there's one company now in the world that still makes movie film, and so you can tell digital media is the real coming thing. And I still shoot everything on film. I'm living in terror of the day that Tri-X quits existing, because I still shoot black and white. Other feast days we went to, and I call them feast days, but you know, this is Portales, and of course you can't be in Portales for Frontier Days without having your sweethearts and queens. But once again, we're looking at how public space is utilized. We use this on a poster for a conference, and this is like, to me, this is Diane Arbus meets Walker Evans meets Miguel Gandert. So it's really, yeah, I mean, it's just so much fun being a photographer. You got to be there. Mesilla, and of course the profound Mexican influence in Las Cruces. And we were just the ability to go and negotiate these spaces, and then the challenge of looking at different ways that I could illustrate these stories and this book, because that's the other thing. My pictures are really about trying to tell stories, and with Jose's drawings, they really freed me to look, because you can go back and you can find the details in the beautiful drawings that are a part of each of these communities. This being Mesilla. My first photographs of Mesilla are very much like the one Chris showed, you know, they're first there, and it's a parking lot. Now it's a really vital, living place. And then we sort of end, and we didn't use much, but Juarez, of course, is always a presence here. And in all of the books that I do about the Southwest and New Mexico, Juarez is really an important place, because culture and architecture and the influence knows no borders and knows no boundaries. When I think of northern New Mexico and how oftentimes I learn things that we aren't as exceptional as we think we are, and when I was growing up here and when I was just driving here, an hour ago or so, you think of Old Santa Fe Trail and Old Pecos Trail, but there was this other trail called the Camino Real that was as equally profound. And so I'm always looking for that connection. I'm right now working on a book that's kind of the sequel to Nuevo Mexico Profundo, which is on the Camino Real. And it starts in Juarez, but it starts in Juarez in a community that was started by New Mexicans in 1580, the Pueblo Revolt. It's a barrio in Juarez called San Lorenzo. And of course, everybody knows that the Pueblo Revolt started for the Feast of San Lorenzo. They were celebrating San Lorenzo because they survived the Pueblo Revolt. And so the new book has that profound connection between San Lorenzo and Juarez, and which has the profound connection to here. and then now goes south and explores that other part of our rich heritage and the dances and rituals, and now the public space. And I can just say that this project really changed the way I see, and I think made it much more full. And working with Chris and Stefanos and Jose Zelaya, and our wonderful designer, Tina Cashel, who made the book make sense, because I'll tell you, there was a lot of stuff we put into the book, has taught me a great deal about being here. So thank you, and we'll answer any questions.